The first thing I heard when I woke up was the soft beep of the heart monitor and my own name spoken like a prayer. The second thing was my daughter's voice in the hallway saying, "It's done. She won't need it anymore." And even through the fog of anesthesia, something in my chest went cold. My name is Evelyn Parker, and I turned 68 last spring. With a slice of grocery store cake and one candle I lit myself. I used to think a quiet life was a kind of blessing. Now I know quiet can also be a place people hide what they're doing to you. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and warmed plastic. The blinds were half open, letting in a thin strip of winter light that made everything look pale. My hands, the white sheets, the little paper cup of ice chips. A nurse with kind eyes checked my IV and asked me to rate my pain. I told her the truth. My body hurt, but it wasn't the part that scared me. I'd come in for what the doctor called a routine procedure. A gallbladder that had been complaining for years finally demanded attention. My neighbor, Mrs. Donnelly, fed my cat and watered the fern by the kitchen window. My daughter, Linda, insisted she would handle everything while I was under. She pressed my forehead with her cool palm the way I used to do when she was small and feverish. "You just rest, Mom," she said. "Don't worry about a thing." I wanted to believe her. I wanted that simple comfort like a blanket. After my husband, Frank, died 8 years ago, believing became a habit I used to survive. Frank was the one who always read the fine print, who kept receipts in a shoebox labeled by month, who knew exactly when the property taxes were due. When cancer took him, it didn't just take a man, it took the steady hand on the wheel. So I learned, slowly. I learned how to set up automatic payments, how to call the bank when the card machine ate my debit card, how to sit on hold with the insurance company without crying. I learned how to be alone without making it everyone else's problem. Linda would tell people, "Mom's doing great," and I was, until I wasn't useful in the ways she liked. That morning in the hospital, before they rolled me into surgery, Linda asked for my purse. "I'll keep it safe," she said, "so it doesn't get lost." My purse held the ordinary pieces of my life. My driver's license, a small wallet, a folded photo of Frank in his old work jacket, the key ring with the brass house key and the tiny church key. My house key. I handed it over without thinking, because mothers spend decades practicing that motion. Give, 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 until it feels like breathing. When I woke up later, my throat was raw and my mouth tasted like pennies. Mrs. Donnelly sat in the chair with a paperback and a knitted scarf draped over her arm. She smiled too quickly when she saw my eyes open. "Oh, Ev," she whispered, "you gave us a scare." "Linda," I tried to say, but it came out like sandpaper. Mrs. Donnelly hesitated. She stepped out, said she had to take a call. The call came to me instead, in pieces. First, a voicemail notification on my phone when the nurse handed it over. My phone that had been turned off and then turned on again, the screen smudged with fingerprints that weren't mine. 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. 2 from my bank, and 1 voicemail from something labeled County Recorder. My heart monitor picked up my breathing before I did. I pressed play with a thumb that suddenly felt too old. A cheerful recorded voice thanked me for my inquiry and confirmed a document recording had been completed for my property address. It mentioned a deed. It mentioned a transfer. It thanked me again, as if this were a gift I'd ordered. I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny holes in them the way I used to count stitches when I was nervous. A deed, a transfer, my address. Mrs. Donnelly watched my face change and sat up straighter. "What is it?" "I don't know," I lied, because something inside me wasn't ready to say the words out loud. If I said them, they would become real. Linda returned an hour later with coffee in her hand and lipstick freshly fixed, as if she'd come from a lunch date instead of my bedside. She kissed my cheek and asked how I was feeling, then glanced at my phone like it had personally offended her. "You shouldn't be stressing," she said gently. "Doctor said you need calm." "Linda," I rasped. "What did you mean earlier? In the hallway?" Her smile didn't move. "Not really." "What do you mean?" "I heard you. You said, 'It's done. She won't need it anymore.'" For half a second, her eyes flickered, like a curtain shifting when someone walks past a window. Then she sighed and sat down, setting her coffee on the little rolling tray like she owned the room. "Mom, don't get dramatic," she said, and that sentence landed harder than any truth could have. "We had to make decisions. You were in surgery. Things happen." "What decisions?" She reached for my hand, and her nails were freshly manicured, pale pink. I thought of my own hands, the skin thin and creased, the faint burn mark on my wrist from a casserole dish years ago. These were the hands that packed Linda's lunches, that washed her school uniforms, that signed every permission slip, that held her after her first heartbreak. "We sold the house," she said, like she was telling me she'd switched phone plans. "It was the smart thing. You're not going back there alone. You'll need care, and honestly, the market is good right now." My mouth opened, but no sound came. Somewhere in the hallway a cart squeaked, a nurse laughed softly, life going on with cruel normalcy. "You can't sell my house," I managed. Linda's expression tightened with practiced patience. "Mom, you were in the hospital. You're not thinking clearly. Gary handled the paperwork." Gary, my son-in-law. The man who never looked me in the eye unless he wanted something. The man who once asked me, casually, if I knew how much my house was worth these days. I tried to sit up, pain blooming along my side, and the nurse rushed in to steady me. Linda stood quickly. "See?" she said to the nurse. "She's agitated. That's what I meant. She gets confused." Confused. That word, soft, polite, deadly, hovered over me like a sheet being pulled up. The nurse gave Linda a careful look and then spoke to me. "Not over me, thus it is, Mrs. Parker. Do you need me to call someone? A social worker? Patient advocate?" Linda's smile snapped back into place. "There's no need. I'm her daughter." But the nurse didn't leave right away. She adjusted my IV with extra slowness, as if giving me time to find my voice. My voice came later, after Linda left again, to handle insurance. It came in the quiet when Mrs. Donnelly went to the cafeteria and the room fell into that sterile hum. I opened my phone and checked my email with shaking hands. There it was, a subject line from my bank. Important, account activity alert. Under it, another message from a real estate company I'd never heard of, thanking me for choosing them and reminding me of my closing date. Closing date. I scrolled through the messages and found a PDF attachment titled with my address. My address, typed neatly like a label on a box. My house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was Frank's laughter in the kitchen, the dent in the hallway where Linda's bicycle handle hit the paint, the lilac bush I planted the year we moved in. It was every bill I paid on time, every mortgage statement I filed away, every repair I made myself, because I didn't want to ask anyone for help. And now, while I lay here with a plastic bracelet on my wrist and a needle in my arm, my daughter had decided I wouldn't need it anymore. I put the phone down and stared at my hands again. For a long time, I did what I've always done. I swallowed my anger so it wouldn't scare anyone. I tried to find a way to blame myself. Maybe I'd trusted too easily. Maybe I'd been too quiet. Maybe I'd let my loneliness make me grateful for crumbs. Then, very slowly, a different feeling settled in. Not rage, not hysteria, something colder and steadier. I reached for the bedside drawer and pulled out the little notepad the hospital provided. My handwriting was shaky, but it was still mine. I wrote down the bank's number. I wrote down county recorder. I wrote down patient advocate. And beneath those, I wrote one more thing, like a promise I was making to my own heart. I am not confused. I am not finished. By the next morning, the fog in my head had lifted, but the weight in my chest had not. Sunlight spilled across the floor in a pale rectangle, and I watched dust float through it, like tiny witnesses. I had slept in short, shallow pieces, waking each time to the same thought. My house was being taken while I lay still. A young woman named Rachel came by mid-morning. Her badge said patient advocate, and she pulled a chair close to my bed instead of standing over me. That small choice mattered more than she knew. "I'm here because the nurse was concerned," she said gently. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to." So, I told her everything. I told her about Linda, about the voicemail, about the emails on my phone that made my hands shake. I told her I had never signed anything, never agreed to sell, never given power of attorney to anyone. As I spoke, I expected to hear myself sound uncertain, elderly, unreliable, but my voice stayed steady. I surprised myself. Rachel took notes. Real notes, not polite nods. She asked clear questions and waited for my answers. When I finished, she said, "Mrs. Parker, selling a house without the owner's consent is not a small misunderstanding. It's obvious." That word landed like an anchor. Serious. She helped me call the bank first. We went through security questions, my mother's maiden name, the first car Frank and I owned. When the representative finally pulled up my account, there was a pause long enough to feel dangerous. "There was a large deposit scheduled," he said carefully. "Proceeds from a property sale. It was redirected yesterday." "Redirected where?" I asked. "To an account not listed under your name." I closed my eyes. Rachel leaned forward. "I did not authorize that," I said. "I want a fraud report opened." Another pause, then typing, then a reference number read aloud, slow and deliberate. It felt like the first brick laid under my feet. The county recorder's office was next. A tired-sounding man confirmed that a quit-claim deed had been filed using my name and signature. When I asked how it had been verified, he explained the process in neutral tones, notarized, submitted electronically, accepted. "I was under anesthesia," I said. "I could not have signed anything." "That's something you'll want to document," he replied. "You may need legal counsel." After the calls, the room felt smaller. I watched a nurse check my vitals, her movements practiced and distant. Linda didn't come by that afternoon. She sent a text instead. "You're upset because you're scared. Let's talk when you're calmer." I stared at the screen, noticing how she avoided details, how she framed my anger as confusion. I didn't respond. For the first time in my life, I let her words sit unanswered. That evening, Gary called. His voice was smooth, almost cheerful. "Evelyn, we did what was best," he said. "You can't manage a house anymore. The paperwork was clean." "You've forged my signature," I said. A laugh, short and dismissive. "No one's going to see it that way. Linda has been helping you for years. Everyone knows that." Everyone. Another soft, dangerous word. After the call ended, I cried. Not loud, not dramatically, just tears slipping sideways into my hair. I cried for Frank, for the years I spent being careful so I wouldn't burden anyone, for the way motherhood teaches you to doubt your own edges. But when the tears stopped, something else remained. The next day, my doctor cleared me for discharge planning. Linda arrived with brochures for assisted living facilities, all smiling seniors and cheerful fonts. She spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if my life were a project she'd wrapped up neatly. "I'll stay with you for a bit," she said, "until we figure out next steps." I'm going home, I replied. She froze. You can't. I can, I said. And I will. Her face hardened. Mom, don't make this difficult. I looked at her then, really looked. The impatience in her eyes, the calculation. I saw not a daughter worried about her mother, but a woman irritated by an obstacle. I want copies of every document you signed, I said. Every receipt, every email. She stood up abruptly. You're being unreasonable. No, I said quietly. I'm being present. That night, after she left, Rachel returned with a thin folder. Inside were printouts. My medical records showing the exact time I was in surgery, the anesthesia notes, the consent forms I had actually signed, evidence of where I was when my name was used elsewhere. Keep these, Rachel said, and consider speaking to an attorney before anyone else. I ran my fingers over the papers, feeling their weight. For years, I had measured my worth by how little trouble I caused. Now, sitting alone in that hospital bed, I began to understand something different. Being quiet had never protected me. It had only made me convenient. And convenience, I was learning, can be very expensive. The lawyer's office smelled like old books and lemon polish, and the clock on the wall ticked loud enough to make me aware of every second I had already lost. My hands rested in my lap, folded the way they always were when I wanted to appear calm. But inside me something was slowly, deliberately waking up. His name was Thomas Reed, late 50s, gray at the temples. He didn't rush me, didn't finish my sentences. He read every document I brought as if my life depended on it. Because in a way, it did. This is not a misunderstanding, he said finally, laying the papers flat on his desk. This is fraud and elder financial abuse. The words felt heavy but also clarifying, like putting on glasses after years of squinting. I told him everything, about Linda taking my purse, about Gary handling the paperwork, about the redirected funds, about the way they spoke to me as if my age made my consent optional. Thomas asked questions that followed a careful path. Dates, times, names. When I hesitated, he waited. You were under general anesthesia at the time the deed was notarized, he said, tapping the medical record. That alone is significant. What happens now? I asked. He leaned back. Now we slow everything down. We document, and we make sure no one moves another inch without consequences. Leaving his office, I felt lighter and heavier at the same time. The sky outside was low and gray, the kind that presses gently on your shoulders. I drove home carefully, every familiar street looking suddenly uncertain, like it might not belong to me much longer. But when I pulled into my driveway, there was a strange car parked near the curb, a white sedan with a real estate logo on the door. A man stood on my porch holding a clipboard. Can I help you? I asked, my voice sharper than I expected. He looked relieved. Mrs. Parker, I'm here to do a preliminary walkthrough. New owners want updated photos. New owners. I felt my knees weaken, but I stayed upright. There are no new owners, I said. This property is under dispute. His expression shifted. Confusion first, then caution. I was told the sale closed. Then you were told incorrectly, I replied. Please leave. He hesitated, then nodded, stepping back. I'll notify my office. I watched him drive away and sat in my car for a full minute before going inside. The house smelled like dust and lavender cleaner, exactly as it always had. My cat wound around my ankles, unaware that his world had nearly been sold out from under him. That afternoon, Linda showed up unannounced. She walked in like she still had every right to, keys jangling confidently. You embarrassed us, she said. The realtor called. I protected myself, I answered. She scoffed. You're overreacting. You should be grateful we took this off your hands." "Grateful," I repeated softly. She paced the living room, gesturing at the furniture. "This place is too much for you. You don't even use half these rooms." "I use them to remember," I said, "and remembering is allowed." Her frustration finally broke through. "You're being selfish." That word, it hit me harder than I expected. For decades, I had bent my life into smaller shapes so others could stand taller. I paid for Linda's college when Frank and I could barely afford it. I watched her children every weekend so she could breathe. I loaned money that was never repaid and told myself love didn't keep score. And now, because I wanted to keep my own home, I was selfish. Have you ever felt something like this? I asked quietly, not just to her, but to the empty air between us. That moment when you realize kindness has been mistaken for weakness? She stared at me, unsettled. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about consent," I said, "and boundaries, and the fact that you crossed both." Her voice rose. "You wouldn't have survived without us." I walked to the desk by the window and picked up a folder Thomas had helped me assemble. Bank records, medical logs, emails, printed and organized, not dramatic, just undeniable. "You're wrong," I said. "I survived cancer with your father. I survived his death. I survived loneliness and fear and learning how to be alone. I will survive this too." Her eyes flicked to the papers. I saw it then, the first hint of doubt. Not guilt, fear. That evening, after she left, I locked the doors and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. I logged into my bank account and changed every password. I called the credit bureau and placed a freeze. I filed a police report, not with anger, but with precision. The officer listened carefully, asked for copies, gave me a case number. Each small action felt like reclaiming a square inch of myself. Later, in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the times I'd told myself it was easier not to argue, easier not to say no, easier to let things slide for the sake of peace. But peace that costs you your dignity is not peace at all. Did you ever realize too late that you were being used? I closed my eyes, not with fear this time, but with resolve. They thought my silence meant surrender. They mistook my age for absence. They were wrong, and soon they were going to understand exactly how wrong they were. The police station was quieter than I expected. No flashing lights, no raised voices, just the low murmur of phones and the smell of burnt coffee. I sat across from a detective named Morales, a man with careful eyes who didn't rush his pen. He read through the documents Thomas had prepared, nodding occasionally. When he reached the medical records, he stopped and looked up at me. "You were under general anesthesia at this time," he said. "Yes," I replied, "for nearly 3 hours. And during that window, a notarized deed was filed in your name." "Yes." He leaned back, exhaled slowly, then continued writing. "That matters." Those words followed me home like a steady hand at my back. Over the next week, my life narrowed into phone calls, emails, and paper. Thomas filed an emergency injunction to halt any further transfer of the property. The bank flagged the redirected funds and froze the receiving account. A fraud investigator requested copies of text messages and call logs. I learned how to export them, one by one, my phone lighting up with months of conversations I'd never questioned before. Reading them now, I saw patterns I'd missed. Linda asking casually about my mortgage balance. Gary suggesting I simplify my finances. Little nudges disguised as concern. The house felt different too. Not unsafe, but alert. I installed a camera at the front door, something Frank had talked about years ago but never bothered with. The installer explained the app patiently, and when the first notification chimed on my phone, I felt a strange comfort. Proof. quietly waiting. Linda stopped calling. She sent one email instead, copied to Gary, telling me we should resolve this privately and reminding me how stressful public disputes could be at my age. Thomas advised me not to respond. "They want control," he said. "Silence is unsettling to people who are used to directing the story." A letter arrived from the real estate company, formal and apologetic. They claimed they had acted in good faith and would cooperate fully. Their tone shifted noticeably once Thomas's letter followed, outlining medical timelines and potential liability. Words like oversight and regret appeared where confidence once had been. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old files in the hallway closet, I found Frank's shoebox. Receipts yellowed with time, mortgage statements from decades ago, the original deed folded carefully. His handwriting labeled everything. I sat on the floor and cried then, not from fear, but from gratitude. He had trusted me to keep going after him, and I had. A week later, Linda showed up again. This time, she knocked. I watched her through the camera app before opening the door. Her posture was different, shoulders tight, confidence thinner. "We need to talk," she said. "We are talking," I replied, staying where I was. She stepped inside, eyes scanning the living room as if measuring what was slipping away. "You didn't have to involve the police." "I did," I said, "because this wasn't a family disagreement. It was a legal violation." Her jaw clenched. "You're blowing this up." "No," I said calmly. "I'm making it visible." She dropped into the armchair, rubbing her temples. "Gary says this could get very bad." I nodded. "It already is." For a moment, she looked tired, almost small. I felt the old instinct rise up, the urge to comfort, to soften, to take responsibility for her discomfort. I let it pass. "You taught me to be fair," she said quietly, "to share." "I taught you to be honest," I replied. "Fairness without honesty is just convenience." She stood abruptly. "So what? You want to ruin us?" "I want my life back," I said. "The rest is a result of your choices." After she left, I sat alone and listened to the house settle, the familiar creaks and sighs. I made dinner for one and washed the dishes slowly. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction yet, just steadiness. The court date was scheduled for the following month. Not a trial, Thomas explained, but a hearing to formally contest the deed and establish the fraud claim. A judge would review the documents, hear statements, and decide whether the sale was void. In the meantime, I kept living. I walked to the corner bakery in the mornings. I chatted with neighbors who suddenly seemed curious, cautious, kind. I learned which of them already knew more than they said. At night, I wrote in a notebook, not plans, not lists, just thoughts. I wrote about how easily a woman's competence is questioned once her hair turns gray, how often silence is mistaken for permission, how quickly love becomes leverage when money enters the room. I wasn't angry all the time. Sometimes I felt oddly peaceful, as if, by refusing to disappear quietly, I had finally stepped fully into myself. The house was still mine for now. But more importantly, so was my voice. The waiting did something to time. Days stretched, then snapped back suddenly, as if the calendar itself couldn't decide how serious this was. I marked dates on the kitchen wall calendar the way Frank used to, circling them carefully in blue ink. Hearing. Call with Thomas. Follow up with the bank. Each circle felt like a stake in the ground. Letters arrived regularly now. Official envelopes with windows cut just right, my name printed in clean black type. One from the bank confirmed the funds were frozen pending investigation. Another from the county acknowledged receipt of my dispute and noted the deed was under review. The language was stiff, impersonal. But beneath it, I felt momentum. Things were moving, even when I was standing still. Thomas called every few days. He never sugarcoated. "They're claiming you verbally agreed," he said once, "that you were confused but cooperative." "That's convenient," I replied. "It won't hold," he said. "We have timestamps, medical logs, and their story keeps changing." I began to notice that too. Linda's messages, forwarded by Thomas, contradicted earlier emails. Dates shifted, explanations softened, confidence thinned around the edges. Truth, I was learning, doesn't need adjusting. One afternoon, a woman from Adult Protective Services visited my home. She introduced herself as Karen, mid-40s, sensible shoes, eyes that had seen too much. She sat at my kitchen table and asked me questions directly, without raising her voice or lowering it artificially. "Do you feel safe here?" she asked. "Yes." "Do you feel pressured by family members to give up property or money?" "Yes." She nodded and wrote, "No judgment, just facts." "Did anyone explain documents to you before asking you to sign?" "No one asked me to sign anything." She looked up then, meeting my gaze. "Thank you for being clear." After she left, I brewed tea and sat quietly, hands wrapped around the mug. There was a strange relief in being believed without having to perform distress. I didn't need to cry or tremble to be taken seriously. I just needed to tell the truth. Linda didn't come by again. Gary sent one email through their attorney suggesting mediation. Thomas advised against it for now. "They want to limit exposure," he said. "A quiet settlement. No admissions." I thought about how often I'd accepted quiet solutions in the past, how often I'd let discomfort slide to keep peace. This time, quiet felt like another erasure. "No," I said, "not yet." At night, memories surfaced uninvited. Linda at 6, missing her front tooth, running toward me after school. Linda at 16, slamming doors, demanding independence. Linda at 35, exhausted and grateful when I took the grandchildren for the weekend. All of it real. All of it complicated. Love doesn't disappear just because trust breaks. That was the hardest part. I still loved my daughter, but I no longer trusted her with my life. The camera app chimed one evening while I was folding laundry. A notification: movement detected. I checked my phone and saw Gary on the porch holding an envelope. I didn't open the door. I spoke through it. "You can leave it there," I said. "Evelyn," he replied, irritation slipping through his calm tone. "We're trying to fix this." "You're trying to manage it," I said. "There's a difference." He slid the envelope under the door and left without another word. Inside were copies of documents I'd already seen, annotated as if explanation could replace consent. I placed them in the growing file cabinet by the window. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house instead, room by room, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the mantel, the door frame where I'd once measured Linda's height in pencil marks. This house had held my life without asking for anything in return. I owed it honesty. In the bedroom, I laid out clothes for the morning. Nothing dramatic, just a navy blouse, pressed, and a cardigan Frank liked. I pinned my hair back neatly and set my papers by the door. I wasn't going to court to perform grief or rage. I was going to present facts. Before turning out the light, I stood at the window and looked at the quiet street. Porch lights glowed softly. Somewhere a dog barked once and settled. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. I realized then that whatever happened next, something fundamental had already changed. I was no longer asking permission to exist fully. I was taking up the space my life had earned, and for the first time since waking up in that hospital bed, I slept through the night. The courthouse air was colder than the weather outside, the kind of cold that lives in stone and polished tile. My shoes clicked too loudly as I walked through the metal detector, and for a moment I felt like a child again, entering a place where adults spoke in rules I didn't understand. Then I felt the weight of the folder in my hands, and I remembered I wasn't here to beg. I was here to be counted. Thomas met me near the hallway benches. He wore the same calm expression he always did, but his eyes checked my face as if he could read my pulse. "You ready?" he asked. "I don't know," I said, "but I'm here." Across the hall, Linda sat beside Gary and their attorney, a sharp-looking woman in a gray suit. Linda avoided my eyes until the last second, then looked at me with a flicker of something that could have been shame if it had stayed long enough. Gary watched the ceiling, as if all of this were an inconvenience happening to him. When the clerk called our case, my stomach tightened. We entered a courtroom that smelled faintly of paper and coffee, and something older, authority maybe. The judge sat higher than everyone else, not to intimidate, but to see. Her nameplate read, Judge Ellen Whitaker. She looked down at her file and then at me, and her gaze didn't soften in a pitying way. It sharpened in a listening way. "Mrs. Parker," she said, "I understand you're contesting a property transfer and a subsequent sale. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, surprised that my voice didn't shake. Thomas stood and introduced himself. The opposing attorney did the same, speaking smoothly about intentions, about family care, about how my daughter acted out of concern. It was strange, hearing my life turned into a story meant to sound reasonable. Judge Whitaker raised a hand slightly. "We are not here for narratives. We are here for facts." Thomas opened our folder and began. He laid out my medical records first, the surgery start time, the anesthesia note, the recovery room log. He handed copies to the clerk, who passed them forward with practiced motions. At 10:14 a.m., Thomas said, Mrs. Parker was under general anesthesia. At 11:02 a.m., the quitclaim deed presented as her signature was notarized. The opposing attorney shifted in her seat. Linda's fingers gripped her purse strap so tightly her knuckles went pale. Judge Whitaker looked at the opposing counsel. "Do you dispute the timeline?" "No, Your Honor," she said carefully. But what?" the judge asked. The attorney cleared her throat. "Mrs. Parker had expressed confusion about her living arrangements. Her daughter believed she had permission." Judge Whitaker's eyes moved to me. "Mrs. Parker, did you give anyone power of attorney?" "No, ma'am." "Did you sign any document transferring your property?" "No." "Did you authorize anyone to sign on your behalf?" "No." There was a silence that felt like a door closing. Thomas then presented the bank statements. He pointed to the expected deposit from the sale, then to the redirection to another account. He provided the bank's fraud case number, the investigator's preliminary findings, and a letter confirming the freeze. Judge Whitaker's voice stayed level. "To whom was the account registered?" Thomas named Gary. A soft sound came from Linda. Not quite a gasp, not quite a breath. Gary's jaw tightened. He didn't look at her. The opposing attorney stood quickly. "Your Honor, the funds were intended to be used for Mrs. Parker's care." "Intent is not a substitute for consent," Judge Whitaker said, and there was no anger in it, just a clean line drawn in ink. Thomas offered one more piece, a brief statement from the hospital's patient advocate confirming my condition and lack of capacity during the time of notarization, plus the police report number and a note that an investigation was active. Judge Whitaker leaned forward slightly. "Counsel, where is the notary?" The opposing attorney hesitated. "Not present today, Your Honor." "Then the notary will be subpoenaed," the judge said, like she was scheduling a dentist appointment. "Because I have a document that claims a signature was witnessed while the signer was unconscious in an operating room." Linda's face drained of color. She finally looked at me, and it wasn't the old look of impatience. It was something closer to panic, as if she had expected me to fold the way I always had. Have you ever sat in a room like that, with your whole life reduced to paper, and realized the truth is still the strongest thing you own? Judge Whitaker turned her attention back to the case file. Effective immediately, this court will issue an order halting any further transfer, encumbrance, or possession change of the property pending full review. The deed is in serious question, the sale is in serious question, and if fraud is established, there will be consequences beyond this courtroom. Her gavel didn't slam. It simply tapped once, like a period at the end of a sentence. Outside, the hallway air felt warmer, even though nothing about the building had changed. Thomas walked beside me as we passed Linda and Gary. Linda started to speak, then stopped, as if her words had finally realized they had no power here. I didn't glare at her. I didn't raise my voice. I just kept walking. In the parking lot, the winter sun sat low, bright but distant. I stood beside my car and exhaled, watching the breath leave my mouth in a soft cloud. My hands still hurt from holding papers too tightly, but my spine felt straighter than it had in years. For a long time, I thought strength meant enduring quietly. That day, I learned it can also mean standing where you have every right to stand and letting the truth speak in a calm voice that does not apologize. The house felt different after the hearing, not because anything physical had changed, but because the waiting had shifted. It was no longer the kind of waiting that eats at you in the dark. It was the kind that breathes, slow and deliberate, like a tide moving in your favor. The court order arrived by certified mail 2 days later. I signed for it myself, the green card cool under my fingers. The language was formal, precise, and unmistakable. Any attempt to sell, rent, transfer, or enter into agreements regarding my property was prohibited. Violations would carry penalties. I placed the document in the front of my folder, not as a trophy, but as a shield. Thomas called that afternoon. "The notary has retained counsel," he said. "That's usually a sign they're concerned." "Concerned about what?" I asked. "About explaining how they witnessed a signature from someone who was in surgery." I pictured the scene and felt no pleasure in it, only inevitability. Linda sent a text that evening. It was short, stripped of decoration. "We need to talk." I didn't answer right away. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of soup, listening to the radiator tick. For years, those words would have sent me into motion, heart racing, ready to fix whatever was broken. This time, I finished my soup while it was still warm. When I did reply, it was just as brief. "You can email my attorney." The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, nothing. In the following weeks, pieces of the truth surfaced slowly, like objects rising after a flood. The real estate company formally withdrew from the sale and issued a letter stating the transaction had been voided due to material misrepresentation. The bank investigator confirmed that the funds would be returned to the originating escrow account once the court finalized its order. Neighbors stopped me on my walks, voices lowered, eyes curious but kind. Mrs. Donnelly brought over a loaf of bread still warm in the middle and hugged me without asking questions. Others shared stories quietly. An aunt who'd been pressured, a father whose finances were suddenly managed by children who knew better. I began to see how common this was, how often age is treated like a crack people can pry open. One afternoon, an email arrived from the notary's attorney. Polite, careful, requesting a sworn statement, confirming I had not been present. I forwarded it to Thomas without comment. "This is where it turns," he told me later. "They're no longer defending, they're containing." At home, I made small changes. I moved my important documents into a fireproof box. I updated my will and named a professional fiduciary as a backup executor. someone with no emotional leverage. I closed accounts Linda once had access to and opened new ones with fresh numbers. Each task was simple, but together they formed something solid. I wasn't building walls, I was building clarity. Linda tried once more, showing up unannounced late one afternoon. I saw her through the door camera, her posture tense, hands empty this time. I opened the door, but I stayed in the doorway. "I just want to explain," she said. "I've heard explanations," I replied. "What I haven't heard is accountability." Her eyes filled, and for a moment, I almost stepped aside. Almost. The years don't erase that instinct. They just teach you to question it. "We were under pressure," she said. "Gary thought—" "I'm not interested in what Gary thought," I said gently. "I'm interested in why you didn't protect me." She swallowed. "I thought I was." I studied her face, searching for the girl I raised. She was there, somewhere, tangled up with fear and greed and justification. "Protection doesn't remove someone's voice," I said. "It amplifies it." She nodded slowly, tears slipping free. "I don't know how we fix this." "I do," I said. "You tell the truth, to the court, to yourself, and you stop trying to control the outcome." She didn't argue. She just stood there, absorbing the weight of it. After she left, I sat in the living room and let the quiet settle. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't grieving either. I was adjusting to a new center of gravity. Some evenings, doubt crept in. I wondered if I'd gone too far, if I'd hardened something that couldn't be softened again. But then I'd remember the hospital bed, the voicemail, the way my life had been decided without me, and the doubt would loosen its grip. The truth was, I wasn't doing this to punish anyone. I was doing it to stop disappearing. I began volunteering 2 mornings a week at the local library, helping children find books and seniors navigate online forms. The librarian showed me how to help people print documents, scan IDs, reset passwords. I smiled at the irony. Knowledge, once shared, has a way of protecting people. One evening, as I locked up my house, I paused with my hand on the doorframe. Frank's pencil marks were still there, faint but visible. I traced them with my finger and felt a deep, steady gratitude. The house had stood through storms before. So had I, and this time neither of us was standing alone. Spring arrived quietly, the way it does when you're not watching for it. One morning I noticed the lilac bush outside my kitchen window had begun to bud, small green promises pushing through old wood. I stood there longer than necessary, hand resting on the counter, letting that simple fact settle into me. Things that are rooted deeply enough will try again. The legal process moved forward in careful increments. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just letters, confirmations, and deadlines met without fuss. The court issued a formal notice voiding the deed, citing lack of capacity and improper notarization. The language was plain, almost dull, but it carried the kind of authority that doesn't need decoration. Thomas called me the moment it was official. "The sale is null," he said. "Legally, it's as if it never happened." I closed my eyes when he said it, not because I was overwhelmed, but because my body finally understood something my mind had been holding together for weeks. The ground under me was solid again. The bank followed with their own confirmation. The funds were returned to escrow, untouched. The receiving account remained under investigation. I didn't ask what would happen next to Gary. That was no longer my concern. Accountability, once set in motion, has its own direction. Linda withdrew her objection shortly after. Her attorney filed a statement acknowledging the court's findings and affirming she would not contest further. No apology came with it. No explanation. Just a quiet retreat. In a way, it fit. Words had never been her strongest offering when things mattered most. Life, meanwhile, kept filling in the spaces between court dates. I took longer walks. I learned which mornings the bakery discounted yesterday's bread and which afternoons the park benches stayed warm longest. At the library, a man my age named Robert started timing his visits to coincide with mine. He had lost his wife 2 years earlier and still spoke about her in the present tense, as if she might walk in late. We talked about books at first, then about the strange relief of not having to pretend you're fine when you're not. At home, I began sorting through what I no longer needed, not in a frantic way, just one drawer at a time. Clothes I hadn't worn since Frank was alive, old instruction manuals for appliances long gone, birthday cards that still made me smile but didn't need to live in a box anymore. Letting go felt different now. It wasn't loss, it was choice. One afternoon, I found the folder Linda had once put together for assisted living facilities. Glossy photos, cheerful slogans, smiling couples holding hands in common rooms that looked nothing like my life. I sat with it for a moment, then fed it slowly into the shredder. The sound was oddly satisfying, the paper disappearing into neat, unreadable strips. The camera at my front door chimed less often these days. When it did, it was usually someone I wanted to see. A neighbor returning a dish, Mrs. Donnelly checking in. Once, a young couple walking past paused to admire the lilacs, and I watched them smile at each other through the app. It reminded me that not everything needs to come inside to be appreciated. There were still hard moments. Some nights, loneliness crept in sharper than before. The kind that comes not from being alone, but from having been misunderstood by someone who should have known you best. I let those nights exist without trying to fix them. I made tea. I listened to old radio programs Frank loved. I let the quiet be quiet. Linda and I spoke only once during that time. She called unexpectedly, her voice subdued. "I just wanted to know, are you okay?" she asked. "I am," I said truthfully. A pause stretched between us. "I didn't think it would go this far," she said. "That's part of the problem," I replied. "You didn't think I would stand." She didn't argue. She didn't agree either. We ended the call politely, like acquaintances who share a complicated history. It hurt, but it didn't hollow me out the way it once would have. Thomas suggested we review my long-term plans now that the immediate crisis had passed. We met again in his office, the same ticking clock, the same lemon polish. This time, the conversation felt different. Not defensive, forward-looking. We talked about safeguards, about transparency, about choosing support rather than having it imposed. I signed documents slowly, carefully, reading every line. Not because I distrusted him, but because I trusted myself. On the drive home, traffic slowed near the school. Children spilled out laughing, backpacks bouncing, lives wide open. I watched them and felt an unexpected tenderness. For all the mistakes I'd made as a mother, I had loved fiercely. That counted for something, even if it didn't protect me from everything. That evening, Robert came by with 2 paper cups of coffee from the cafe down the street. We sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, turning the sky the color of peaches. "You seem lighter," he said. "I am," I replied. "Not because things are easy, because they're honest." He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. When he left, I stayed outside a little longer, listening to the neighborhood settle. A door closing, a car starting, wind moving through leaves that had survived another winter. I realized then that the revenge everyone imagines isn't loud or cruel. It doesn't gloat. Real retribution is quieter. It's reclaiming authorship. It's refusing to let someone else finish your sentences or sell your memories for convenience. Inside, I locked the door and leaned my forehead briefly against the wood, a gesture I hadn't made in years. Gratitude moved through me, steady and warm. My house was still standing. My name was still my own, and for the first time in a long while, my future felt like something I was allowed to imagine again. Summer didn't announce itself. It simply arrived one morning with open windows and the sound of lawn sprinklers clicking on and off down the block. I stood at the sink rinsing blueberries, watching water bead on their skins, and realized I was no longer bracing for the next phone call. The waiting had ended. What remained was living. The court's final order came through in late June. It confirmed what had already become real in my bones. The deed was void, the sale erased, the property restored to me without condition. The language was calm, final, almost understated. I read it twice, then placed it in the fireproof box and closed the lid with a soft click. There was no need to keep it close anymore. Thomas called to say his work on the case was nearly done. We spoke about ordinary things for a few minutes: weather, traffic, his daughter starting college. Before hanging up, he paused. "You handled this with remarkable clarity," he said. "A lot of people don't." "I had practice being quiet," I replied. "I just stopped." He laughed softly and wished me well. Gary's name appeared once more, indirectly, in a bank letter notifying me that the investigation had concluded and funds would remain frozen pending separate proceedings. No details, no drama. I didn't feel satisfaction reading it, just distance. His choices had moved beyond my life. Linda didn't reach out again, not by text, not by email. The absence was its own kind of presence. Heavy at first, then slowly less so. I learned that grief can exist without catastrophe. It can be quiet and long and survivable. I filled my days with small structures: Tuesdays and Thursdays at the library, Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, where I learned the names of vendors and which peaches were worth the price. I started cooking for myself again, real meals instead of whatever was easiest. Chopping onions felt grounding, the knife steady in my hand, the rhythm familiar. One afternoon, while sorting mail, I found a handwritten note tucked between bills. The envelope was plain, the handwriting careful. "Evelyn, I don't know if I have the right words. I'm writing because not writing feels worse. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I told myself I was helping. I wasn't. I'm trying to understand that now. Linda." I sat at the table for a long time holding the paper. The apology wasn't complete. It didn't undo anything. But it was a beginning, and beginnings have their own weight. I placed the note in a drawer, not as forgiveness, not as evidence, but as a marker of where we were. I didn't write back right away. I wasn't withholding. I was listening to myself. Robert became a regular part of my weeks. We didn't label anything, didn't rush to define what companionship should look like at our age. We shared meals sometimes, traded books, walked the park paths in the evenings when the heat softened. He never asked about the case unless I brought it up. He never assumed he knew what was best for me. That alone felt like respect. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching fireflies blink into existence, he said, "You know, most people think strength looks like pushing." "What does it look like to you?" I asked. "Standing still when someone's trying to move you," he said. I smiled, because he was right. I made one final appointment with the county recorder's office. Not because it was required, but because I wanted to see it for myself. The clerk pulled up the records on her screen, typed efficiently, and turned the monitor slightly toward me. "There," she said. "Clean chain of title, no encumbrances." Clean. The word felt ceremonial. I thanked her and walked out into the bright afternoon, the sun sharp and honest. At home, I pulled out an old photo album I hadn't opened in years. Frank and me at the beach, hair blown wild. Linda as a toddler, serious and stubborn even then. The pictures hadn't changed, but I had. I could hold them now without collapsing into what-ifs. Memory no longer felt like a trap. I thought about the woman I had been before the hospital. Careful, accommodating, always smoothing edges. I didn't judge her. She did what she knew how to do. But I was different now. Not hardened, just clearer. On the last Sunday of the month, I hosted a small dinner. Mrs. Donnelly came, Robert, of course, a neighbor from down the street, and a woman from the library who had become a friend. We ate simply and laughed easily. When the dishes were done, we sat around the table long after sunset, talking about nothing important and everything that was. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I walked through the house turning off lights. In the hallway, I paused at the pencil marks on the doorframe. I didn't need to measure anyone anymore. I touched the wood lightly, then kept walking. In the bedroom, I opened the window and let the summer air move through the room. Somewhere nearby, music played softly. Life, unbothered, continued. I lay down and realized I wasn't replaying conversations or rehearsing defenses. I wasn't bracing for loss. I was simply tired in the way that comes from a full day. My house was quiet, not empty, quiet. And in that quiet, I felt something settle into place that I hadn't known was missing. A steady, unarguable sense that my life belonged to me, without explanation, without apology, and without fear. The first morning of autumn came with a thin chill, and the sound of leaves scraping softly along the sidewalk. I stood at the front window with my coffee and watched the neighborhood wake up, feeling a calm I hadn't felt in years. Not relief exactly, completion. The final court notice arrived that afternoon, delivered by a courier who asked for my signature and waited patiently as I read the first paragraph. It confirmed everything already settled in practice, the fraudulent deed permanently voided, the attempted sale expunged from record, the matter closed on my end. No further action required from me. My name, my house, my authority restored. I signed slowly and handed the clipboard back with a small nod. When the door closed, I didn't rush to call anyone. I didn't cry. I simply sat down at the kitchen table and let the quiet hold me. Later that week, I met Thomas one last time. We shook hands, and he smiled in that reserved way professionals do when they're proud but won't say it outright. "You did this the right way," he said. "You stood firm without becoming bitter." "I didn't want revenge," I replied. "I wanted truth to stand where I had been pushed aside." He nodded. "That's usually the strongest position." Linda never contested again. Through her attorney, she submitted a written acknowledgement to the court. It wasn't poetic or emotional, just factual. Enough. We exchanged a few emails after that, careful, measured, honest in a new way. We are not what we were, we may never be, but we speak now without pretending, and that matters more than comfort ever did. My life settled into a shape that finally felt like my own. I kept volunteering at the library. I joined a small walking group for seniors who didn't want to be treated like glass. I traveled once, just a short train trip to the coast, and stood by the water with my hands in my pockets, smiling at nothing in particular. Robert and I continued exactly as we were. No promises, no fear. Just shared time and mutual respect. At this age, that's not settling, that's choosing wisely. Sometimes people ask me if I regret taking things so far, if it was worth the strain, the exposure, the fracture in my family. I tell them the truth. What I regret is how long I believed silence was kindness. What I regret is how often I let my needs become negotiable because I was afraid of being difficult, afraid of being alone, afraid of being seen as old and in the way. The house still creaks at night. The lilac bush still blooms every spring. Frank's pencil marks are still faint on the doorframe. Nothing about the space changed, but everything about how I inhabit it did. I'm not confused. I am not finished. And I am no longer invisible. If you're listening to this, and something in my story feels uncomfortably familiar, I want to leave you with this thought. Dignity does not fade with age. It only disappears when we stop defending it. Thank you for sitting with me through this story, for listening without interrupting, the way I once needed someone to listen to me. If this story meant something to you, I invite you to like it, subscribe, and share your thoughts. And tell me, if you were in my place, what would you have done?